Well, greetings. Hello again. And here we are today talking about Revelation again. Last time I did just a general introduction of why it's important to study the book of Revelation and how you view Revelation and end times theology can actually affect your life. And I know that does not seem to be the case. But when you actually go back and start studying these ideas, just like if you studied philosophies that have come before our time now, you start to realize how those affect our thinking and how we live and choices we make and affect the culture today. Now, let's talk about the millennium. This is coming from Revelation chapter 20. Revelation chapter 20. And I know that's an odd place to start. But how you view the millennium actually is the place to start because it's going to affect how you interpret the book. So let's go to Revelation chapter 20. This is what it says. This is the first 3 verses. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. And he seized the dragon, that ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years and threw him into the pit, and shut it and sealed it over him so that he might not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were ended. Now, we've discussed that many people today absolutely avoid the study of Revelation and end times theology, sometimes called eschatology. This is very unfortunate because Paul, when he speaks to the elders at Ephesus in Acts chapter 20, this is what he says. I did not shrink from declaring to you the whole counsel of God. This means we should consider all that the Bible has to say. And our belief system, our theology, what we believe about God, about Christianity, should and does include the end times. It does include Revelation, Matthew 24, Daniel 9. It does include those things. And throughout this course, as we speak about these things, I want you to continue to ask the practical question, why does it matter? That is a very valid question, and we want to continually ask that. Because when you study eschatology, sometimes it's not clear how this applies. It does apply. The principles do apply. But you have to work a little bit harder sometimes to see that. How does my belief about the millennium affect my daily life? Think about that question. Now, the word millennium comes from 2 Latin words, mille meaning 1,000 and annus, which means year, giving the obvious meaning 1,000 years. This period of time, the millennium, referred to in Revelation 20, what I just read, is not mentioned in this same way anywhere else in the Bible. But I should note, I think I've already said this, but I should note, that's a technical way to put it. It doesn't call that particular time period the millennium other places in the Bible. However, it is mentioned other places. Now, it is a valid question to ask. Why in Revelation 20 does it use this word millennium but nowhere else? Let's take a moment and consider what Revelation 20 actually says. There's actually a lot there in just those first few verses. Let's get an overall picture. Talks about an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. He seizes the dragon, and John makes it very clear who he's talking about. The ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan. And he binds him, he's bound for 1,000 years. Throws him to a pit, and it's sealed over him. Now think about this for a minute. It's very important when you're reading a book, the book of Revelation in this case, to look at the author and the genre so you can actually understand what it's talking about, what it means, right? And so you don't get yourself into error. So we're reading Revelation, a book known for its signs, symbols, and visions, right? It's a book of visions. At the very beginning, the Apostle Paul tells us, blessed is he who reads aloud the words of this prophecy. It's a prophecy, right? And then a few verses down, this is in the first chapter, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet saying, write what you see in a book and send it to the 7 churches. That's verse 10 and 11 of the first chapter. So Revelation is a prophecy that includes a series of visions. This means that the language is going to be highly symbolic. The book of Revelation is considered apocalyptic literature. Now, what does that mean? That is a genre of prophetic writing that details an author's vision that is usually given by an angel or a messenger. And some parts of the Old Testament prophetic books are actually written this way, and they're called apocalyptic literature. But the entire book, that's right, the entire book of Revelation is written in this genre. Again, what does that mean? It means the book in the language of Revelation is highly symbolic. Let me ask you a question about Revelation 20. Does the angel in Revelation 20 have a real key and a real chain? Is it a real key and a real chain? Is it possible to bind a spiritual being with literal keys and chains? If the language is symbolic, what does that tell us about the 1,000-year reign of Christ, the millennium? See, these are the questions you need to ask, and these are the questions you're going to be considering throughout this course as we explore first the 4 views of the millennium, and then look at the book as a whole, the book of Revelation. Keep these things in mind, and remember, what you believe is going to affect how you live. It's going to affect you. Yes, even the book of Revelation. Nothing is in a safe zone. Ideas have consequences. Now, let's transition and move. I'm just going to define just a few terms here, and then we're going to actually get into the 4 main schools of interpretation of the book of Revelation. Now, let's just look at a few terms. You may already know these, but it's good to have everybody on the same page, right? I already mentioned eschatology. That actually comes from 2 Greek words, eschatos, which means last, and logos, which means the word, meaning the doctrine of the last things. There's another term you may not be familiar with. It's called ante-Nicene Chiliasm. Ante-Nicene Chiliasm. If you do a quick search on YouTube, you'll find some really interesting commentary on that word. Now, what does it mean? Well, the ante-Nicene, ante means before. It basically means before the Nicene Council, which occurred in 325. Chiliasm is actually from the Latin. It just means 1,000. So basically, this term means ante-Nicene Chiliasm refers to the belief of Christ's expected return to earth for 1,000-year reign, and that belief that was held in the first 300 years of Christianity. Now, what does that mean? Obviously, it means the belief they held before the Nicene Council. A lot of people say this is basically pre-millennialism. Okay? But you have to be careful here, because as we go through this study, you're going to note that everyone wasn't necessarily a premillennialist in the first 300 years. But that's basically what that word means. It's this idea about the millennium, Christ's expected return for 1,000-year reign, right? And it is basically, Chiliasm is premillennialism. Now, what is premillennialism? Just in its basic form, this is what it means. It's just the belief that Jesus is going to return to earth before the millennium. He's going to return first, and then you're going to have the 1,000 years. What is postmillennialism? Now, postmillennialism is the belief that Jesus is not going to return until after the millennium. Now, that's important when we talk about both amillennialism and postmillennialism. Okay? He returns after the 1,000 years. Now, what is amillennialism? This is the belief that there is no millennium, or that millennial period, that time period, is not limited to 1,000 years. In other words, it's symbolic. And again, this system also believes, just like postmillennialism, that Jesus will return after the 1,000 years, which is symbolic in amillennialism. He's going to return after the millennium. Okay. Rapture. That's another term that we use. It's a hot topic, right? When you talk about the end times, the rapture. The word rapture actually is not in the English translations of the Bible. It actually comes from the Latin Vulgate. And it comes from 1 Thessalonians 4:17, and it translates the verb caught up. The rapture means that believers will be caught up from heaven to earth. That was in reverse, sorry. Caught up from earth to heaven at Christ's second coming. This refers to those who are living and they join those who have already died in Christ. That's the rapture. We're raptured up, right? To be with Christ. Now, pre-tribulation view. Okay? This is typically within the dispensational premillennialism. But what does pre-tribulation mean? It means that believers are caught up 7 years before Christ returned to the earth. It's basically a 7-year, it's talking about the 7-year tribulation. And it's when it says pre-tribulation, it means that believers are caught up before that tribulation period. So what is the mid-trib or mid-tribulational view? Basically, that means it's in the middle. Believers experience part of the tribulation, again talking about a 7-year tribulation, but in the middle at 3.5 years, we're caught up to be with Christ. Okay? That's also typically part of the dispensational view. Now we have the post-tribulational view, and this means the rapture occurs at the same time as Christ's visible return to earth. Post, of course, meaning after the tribulation. Now those are just some basic terms. I know that wasn't that exciting, but just some basic terms so you make sure and understand what we're talking about when we use these words like premillennialism, postmillennialism, amillennialism, rapture, those kinds of things. So you know what we're talking about. So now let's talk about the 4 schools of interpretation of the book of Revelation. Okay? And then after that is when we're going to get actually to the 4 views. The first of these is what's called historicism. Now, historicism teaches that Revelation is a symbolic book over the course of history, starting at the time of St. John and going all the way to the end of the age. So the historicist sees Revelation as depicting major events in Christian history. However, it is particular to Western European history. Now, this view is very popular during the Reformation, like during the time of Martin Luther and others. They basically claim that the Pope and the Roman Church were the beast of Revelation. An example of, like with the trumpets, how they interpret that is like the Goths. I know that's really going back in history, but the Goths against the Western Roman Empire was like the first trumpet. Okay, the third trumpet might be interpreted as the raid of the Huns under Attila. Okay, and I know some of this may be some esoteric references. Other identifiers within this particular view are that the monks and friars are locusts. Elizabeth I is the first bowl, or part of the first bowl. Martin Luther is the angel of Sardis, and it goes on and on and on, and you can see how some of this just seems a little ridiculous. But this is part of this particular view. Like I said, it was very popular during the Reformation. Now, you can probably realize that there's several problems with this view. For one, it tends to cluster events, but really within a short period of time within history and Western European history, as I've already stated. And also, it creates this endless speculation of the events in history. In other words, it continually has to be updated based on what happens throughout history. The other thing I would note that's very important, it really does not have any biblical support. Okay? But this is one of the schools of interpretation. Okay? The critics agree that there are several weaknesses, but they can be boiled down to 3 main problems. Number 1, the interpretation are only concerned with the Western Church or Western Church history. Number 2, the wide and varied interpretation are nothing more than unsupported speculation. Not a good thing, right? And lastly, the facts of the view must be reworked with each new period of history. And that, my friends, is historicism. Okay? The second school of interpretation is what's called futurism. And that's exactly what you think. It holds that there's a future fulfillment to most of the book of Revelation. Typically, the way futurists view this is the first 3 chapters of Revelation are in the present, like when John was writing. But starting with chapter 4 all the way to the end of the book, this is a future fulfillment. It's still out in the future and it has not taken place. Now, really, we're going to get into this later, but there's really 2 forms of futurism. It's dispensational premillennialism and also classic or historic premillennialism. Both of those are within futurism. Now, dispensationalism is very popular today, and that's okay. It's okay for something to be popular. But just because something's popular does not necessarily make it true. But that is within that school. And as we have seen, certain books and movies like Left Behind, that is that particular view within futurism. It basically teaches that God works through dispensations of time that focus on God's covenant people, Israel. Now, this view makes a clear distinction. This is important. A clear distinction between the Jews and the Christians in theology, okay? They consider the church age a parenthesis, if you will, in God's plan. Now, dispensational futurism demonstrates that there will be a 7-year, we already mentioned this, there will be a 7-year tribulation in the future when the Antichrist will reveal himself and usher in a great tribulation. Now, the church will be raptured up to heaven at the beginning of this time, right? Pre-tribulation, escaping catastrophic events. After the tribulation is over, Christ will return and set up a literal millennial reign for 1,000 years. The hallmark of this view is a literal interpretation of Scripture, including symbolic books like Revelation. That's important. Now, in the classic approach, this is important because the classic approach is different. Dispensations are not used, but Christ does return after the tribulation to set up the millennial kingdom. However, the entire church and the nation of Israel go through the tribulation period. And that's according to the classic approach. And that is the basics of futurism. Okay? Now let's look at the third school of interpretation. That's called preterism. Now, preter comes from the Latin. It basically means past. So this belief is the view that the prophecy of Revelation, it is a prophecy, right, was fulfilled in the 1st century. Okay? However, there are actually 2 schools within preterism, and that is a very important point to note. There's 2 schools of preterism. The 2 schools are partial preterism and full preterism. Now, partial preterism views most of the prophecies of Revelations as fulfilled with the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, which was a major event in history, right? But then chapters 20 to 22 they see as future events. And when you read those chapters, that's obvious why they think that. Now, the view of the resurrection of believers, the final judgment, and the literal return of Jesus Christ to the earth is future. Again, in that Revelation 20 to 22. But full preterism is a little bit different. This believes that all the book of Revelation was fulfilled in the 1st century and believes that Jesus returned at that time. In other words, he returned in 70 AD. Now, that may be a difficult pill for some people to swallow, but that's what that means. So some view full preterism as heretical because of that. The return of Jesus being in 70 AD. Now, preterism sees Matthew 24 as fulfilled because Jesus says this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. And we're going to talk about that later. That's Matthew 24:34. Roughly 40 years later in 70 AD, what Christ said came true. It's a very important prophecy in the Bible. With the destruction of Jerusalem in the temple in a most devastating way by the Romans. And if you don't know your history, you need to look that stuff up. It's in the Bible. Jesus prophesied it. Now, partial preterism has gained much ground in recent times with proponents such as R.C. Sproul. However, One of the chief problems with this view is that it requires the writing of Revelation when it was written to be before 70 AD. And we'll talk about that more later. Will Durant, the author of the classic masterpiece of history called The Story of Civilization, in his volume called Caesar and Christ, really good book, by the way, suggests Revelation was written in 69 or 70 AD. Again, there's some disagreement about when it was written. And again, for preterism to work, the date of the writing has to be around the mid-60s or earlier. And later on, what we're going to do, I'm actually going to do a section on the dating of the book of Revelation, because it does matter. It does matter as far as which view you're going to hold. Now let's move on to the fourth school of interpretation. This is called idealism. Okay? And it's usually, not always, but usually associated with amillennialism. The idealist view is sometimes referred to as the spiritual view. Okay? It's like an allegory, an allegorical interpretation of Revelation. The basic idea is that the imagery set forth in the book of Revelation is about a timeless struggle of good versus evil, or God versus Satan, and that none of the visions can be tied to specific historical events. The allegory shows us that while God's people do suffer, right? In the end, God is victorious Christ. The wars in Revelation can be seen as spiritual warfare, Christian wars in a general sense. However, for the idealists, the trials of the first century church are represented in Revelation in symbolism and directly relevant to that audience as well. However, the idealist does not believe that the beast and the false prophet, etc., is just Roman armies or false religious systems of the first century. Okay? The advantage of this view is that it frees us from specific historical events being applied to the text, which make the book of Revelation very relevant to any period in history, any time, right? In this way, it teaches timeless spiritual truths, which makes it very powerful. Now, one other term I want to give you, okay? This usually falls within idealism. It's a term that's called progressive parallelism. And I know I've given you a lot of terms, but some of this you really need to understand. It's called progressive parallelism. Basically, the visions of Revelation describe the course of history between the first and second coming of Christ. Each vision is given a different perspective. In other words, the Apostle John used a linguistic or literary device called parallelism, where the visions recapitulate or repeat. However, with each vision, there is more detail, or in a way, in the text, it progresses. So it's called progressive parallelism. And we will definitely be talking about this in the coming days as we discuss Revelation. It's basically a literary device, and it's used in other parts of the Bible, such as Daniel. Typically, those that believe in this progressive parallelism, are typically idealist. But it's an important principle to know about in the idealist view, and we will be talking about that. So this is basically the four views, or the four schools of interpretation: historicism, futurism, preterism, and idealism. Okay? And I've given you a broad perspective on all these different views. And what we're going to do next is actually get into each of the four views of the millennium, starting with historic premillennialism. We're going to get into the four views. And I know some people may be thinking, why is this important? The reason I'm giving you all this background now is so you'll understand when we get into the meat. And it really is going to help you. Okay? You need to get an understanding first, and then you can get to the application. And I promise you, what you believe about Revelation, which view you ascribe to, if you choose one, it makes a difference. I promise you it does. And as we go through that, you're going to see that. But first, we have to get some of the meat of the millennium into you so you understand what the different views are, so you can better understand the book of Revelation, which is the Word of God. You do need to understand it. It will really benefit your life and practically speaking, how you live your life. It'll give you a depth of understanding of who Jesus Christ is, because it is the revelation of Jesus Christ. Have a good and blessed day. And next time, we're going to get into historic premillennialism.